Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. So today we're going to, I don't want to say finish up, but finish up the history of video games, basically. Now, the range that we're going to cover in doing that is pretty darn broad. And what I mean by that is we go from 2004 with the release of the Nintendo DS all the way up to the present. Okay, so we're covering about 15 or 16 years worth of stuff. Okay, now within that, there are 3 different console generations. Okay, in that time period, one of which is the longest generation in the history of video games. And that would be the 7th generation. Yes, 7th generation, the one that the Xbox 360 is part of. That lasted from, if memory serves, I believe it lasted from 2005 to 2015, like 10 years, or 2014 maybe, 13, somewhere in that realm. With the release of the Xbox One, like 2030. Either way, it was like 8 or 9 years, which is just an eternity for a console generation, right? And then we had the next generation, which began with the release of the
PS5?
PS4.
PS4. Oh. Wait, PS4 was after Xbox One?
Sorry. Wait. Okay, so we have. I'll get to this all here in a minute. But we have the Xbox 360 and the PS3, right?
Yeah.
And then our next generation and the Wii, right? Then the Wii U comes out, right? We get the PS4 and the Xbox One.
I think you said Xbox One instead of Xbox 360.
Yeah, I think that's where I messed it up. Yeah, and then the Switch comes out, and then we get the PS5 and the Xbox One X, right? So what starts kind of interestingly happening is Nintendo just kind of gives up on console generations, starting with the Wii U. They just kind of say, you know what, we're just going to release things when we release them, and people can just play them and enjoy them. We're done with this like competing with like other people, like who has the best graphics, who has the whatever. We're just going to release stuff, right? So love or hate Nintendo. It's kind of a groundbreaking perspective to take, especially when you were the originators of the 3rd generation, right? Like I mean, you kind of like spurred that on and made it sort of happen, and then here we are now in the present where you've now had 2 consoles that have existed in 3 different console generations. The Switch is part of this generation, but it's also part of the previous generation, right? And so kind of what they're doing is they're actually kind of taking a Sony and Microsoft approach to it, which is they're releasing upgraded versions, right? There's supposed to be one coming out at Christmas with like 4K output and like a bigger screen and stuff and different things like that. So pretty cool, right? So we'll talk about that. We're also going to have a quick PowerPoint over the department's roles and process of game development. Now, that's something that in future semesters, I'm going to talk about probably early on, and then I'll do like the first week with this stuff, then we'll start with the history on the second week. But I just got to thinking about, I mean, we talked about this stuff, but we've not done a formal PowerPoint on it. So I made this over the past week, and I really liked it. So I think I'm gonna start incorporating it earlier in the semester going forward. But we'll talk about, kind of who does what and how they kind of do it and that sort of thing. And we'll have one slide about video game genres. Which again, if we were talking earlier in the semester, that we've already kind of decided what we're doing, but we would be able to kind of make that decision. And then we are going to end with a demonstration on making music for your game, and we'll have a project which is you just got to make me a 15 to 30 second little musical piece. It doesn't have to be good. I mean, I don't expect any of you to be musicians. Just you know what sounds good. So, I mean, if nothing else, look up like a MIDI, because it kind of uses like a MIDI sort of like timeline. Kyle knows the software I'm talking about, but it uses kind of like a MIDI-esque timeline. So if you're familiar with like FL Studio or something like that, it's very similar, which is to say, just go look up one of those and just duplicate what they do if need be, if you're not musically inclined. I'm not, like I said, not expecting anyone to be. And then we're going to end the lecture portion right before we go on break. We're going to end the lecture portion with a hopefully very brief, very productive, and very respectful conversation about diversity and inclusion as it applies to game design. There have been some developments that have occurred over the past couple of weeks and months that I think make this a worthwhile conversation. Now, I will stop recording before that happens because I don't want the idea that this is both being broadcast live right now and also could be watched on demand later to make anyone shy about speaking their mind. Now, I don't mean speaking your mind in terms of like being offensive and mean. I'm just saying that like if you have a perspective that you want to share or a question or a thought or something like that, and you're like, oh boy, I don't want the whole world to hear this. I just want the people in this room to hear this. That's what I'm doing that for. So just so you know, when we get to that portion, I'll remind you again that I'm stopping the stream and the recording and everything. So nobody worry about speaking and talking and discussing during that portion. Okay? All right. So let's hop over here first and let's watch, or not watch, excuse me, let's look at this PowerPoint here. Let's see. Excellent. Okay. So there's that. Okay. So I'm probably going to have to get rid of that video at some point because I'm kind of in the way of everything. But anyway, so the state of things. 2004 to present, okay? Again, like I said a moment ago, this is going to cover a very, very large amount of time. The biggest reason that I'm not going to, okay, so like the PS5 and the Xbox One X are not part of this presentation. One, because they're brand new. So I mean, like what could I say that you've not already heard on the news, right? And kind of the same thing about all of these generations, because these are all right smack dab in everybody's lifetime. Right? There is nobody in here that I'm going to talk about a console or a device or something that you're going to be like, what? I've never heard of that before, right? So you are the historians, you know, when it comes to this sort of stuff. So I didn't feel like there was any need to harp on. It's kind of like when you take like a modern American history class. Like at the very beginning, they're like, hey, let's talk about the 1950s, the 1960s, right? And you're like, oh, this is really cool. And then when they get to like 2008, you're like, yeah, I remember this, right? Like you're like, yeah, I was around for this. I recall this. I don't need a history lesson, like, because this was, you know, a couple of years ago or whatever. So anyway, moving along. So this is the 7th generation. We have the Xbox 360 on November 22nd, 2005, the PS3 in November of 2006, the Wii in that same month of that same year. Quick sidebar about the Wii's launch. I had convinced myself that I was going to get a Wii on launch day. I've never owned a console on launch day. You've heard me say that before. It's something I've always wanted to do. I've never been able to make it happen thus far. And I was like, no, I'm going to do it. South Park did an episode about it. I was like, this is really cool. Like, I don't know, like, I hadn't heard a lot of buzz on like the news and stuff about the Wii. So I was like, cool, like nobody really knows about it. I'm going to be able to just like go in and buy one, right? Yeah. So it launched on, let's say, a Saturday night. Okay, well, on Friday evening, I was still living back home at the time, and I was going to drive to Springfield that night to see some friends of mine at Missouri State. And before I did that, I went in and I said, hey, have you had anybody come in and inquire about the Wii? And they said, yeah. And I said, really? They were like, yeah, we've got like, you know, 50 people in line or whatever. And I'm turning around like, what line are you talking about? They're like, oh no, they're out back in their cars. And they camped out for 24 hours.
For a week.
Well, not at that particular one. No, it was just a weekend. It was just like just a couple of days. Actually, I take that back. It launched on a Monday. Actually, I think it launched over like President's Day weekend or something. I feel like that's maybe what it was. No, because it was in November. I don't know what it was, but anyway, the point of my story is that they waited for at least a day, perhaps 2 or 3. But anyway, they camped out in their cars. And they were gone like that. Every game and system gone within literally 2 minutes. Right? So I didn't get one until Christmas of that year, and I only got it because my aunt worked at Walmart, and she heard that they announced over the speakers that they had gotten a shipment in, and so she went and clocked out because she can't buy stuff on the clock. She went and clocked out, bought the Wii for me, and clocked back in, which is super cool. Anyway, the Nintendo DS. I got, obviously, before I got a Wii U, or before I got a Wii, because it came out 2 years earlier. That was a birthday present from my parents, which was super cool. Because all of my friends had DSs and they were always playing like Mario Kart and stuff, and I was super super jealous. And my mom and dad for my birthday that year got me a DS and then gave me like $100 to go buy some like games for it. So I got like some Game Boy Advance games. I got like a Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls and stuff. Then I also got Mario Kart, of course, and all that stuff. Then I got suckered into buying Yoshi's Touch and Go, which if you've not played Yoshi's Touch and Go, you can beat the entire game in less than a minute. I was very angry because I thought it was a remake of Yoshi's Island. It was not. It was not. It was one very short mini game. Like it was. I was quite angry. Anyway, so the PSP in 2005. I remember my buddy buying the PSP and we watched Spider-Man 2 on it on the little UMD. And I remember like we were like laying on my bed. So it's like. Like thinking back on it now, like it must have been a very weird visual for anyone that like saw us. We're just like laying there on my bed. He's got the PSP like up in the air so we can see it, and we're laying there. And for like 2 hours, we laid there and watched all of Spider-Man 2 on this itty bitty little 2-inch screen.
Yeah.
Man, we thought it was. Like, I was like, man, this is the highest quality video I've ever seen.
I remember when I got a PSP, I was.
Oh yeah, like
ecstatic.
it's sad that like UMD never took off because it was a really cool idea. Like it was a cool concept. It's like they're DVDs, but they're tiny, and I don't know.
And they're in a little plastic case.
A little plastic case that, yeah. Oh, the PSP. And then other consoles, such as Mattel released one around this time, the Hyperscan, I believe it was called. I don't know. There were other tiny consoles like that. Okay, the 8th generation, the Wii U. All right. In 2012, the Xbox One in 2013, PS3 that same year, the Switch in 2017, the 3DS in 2011, the PS Vita in 2011, and then retro devices like the Retron, other Hyperkin products, the Super Nintendo and the NES Mini, the Genesis Mini, right? Now, you'll notice that I've got the Switch on there. Remember, I told you it was part of multiple generations, right? So, as you can see, as far as consoles go, like not handhelds, but traditional consoles, Nintendo was first in line again, or well, I guess they were. Was it second in line before? Third, well, they were tied with the PS3, I guess. No, well, the DS if you're considering that one. But anyway, and then so yeah, we see the retro devices start to happen. The 3DS and the PS Vita. The PS Vita is Sony's like last handheld. They've kind of indicated they're not going to go that route again. And really, there's no reason to, especially when you can release stuff on either do like streaming to someone's phone or like release games directly on the mobile phone and that sort of thing, which we'll talk about that here in a minute. And the 3DS, it's still around, kind of. I mean, they still release games for it periodically, but like they've also indicated Nintendo has that like they're going the Switch, since it's mobile and a console both. They're going that way. And then mobile devices also. Okay, the 9th generation, the Switch, 3DS, still. The Xbox One X, PS5. Now here are those retro devices. We have a Genesis Mini. That's the analog pocket there in the middle that plays Game Boy games via hardware emulation. Well, not hardware emulation, but via using similar hardware as opposed to software emulation. That's an NES Mini. Down on the bottom, it's a Super Nintendo Mini. And the one thing on the right is the Retron 5, which plays like Super Nintendo, it plays Super Nintendo, regular Nintendo, Genesis, and something else, I think. I can't remember what the other ones are. Also, on this previous slide, all of the like arcade one-up cabinets, right? I mean, like retro gaming is kind of starting to make a splash, right? A big splash. Now we got the iPhone, released on January 9th, 2007. I vividly remember this day. I vividly remember watching Steve Jobs announce this thing. And I literally couldn't believe it. I remember like looking at this thing and thinking like, how in the world does that work? Like, I had a DS already, right? Because it had come out several years earlier. So I was familiar with the idea of a touchscreen. Touchscreens weren't like brand new. I've got a bullet pointer saying it says it was the first touchscreen phone. That's a more or less basically true. I mean, there were some devices that were released. I think the Nokia N-Gage had a touchscreen. Maybe I don't remember exactly. But the idea of like touchscreen devices and things like that was around, but no one had taken it and really made a mobile phone in this sort of way, right? Certainly not one that was effectively buttonless, right? That was like built around, because all those other devices like the DS, for example, have a ton of buttons and a touchscreen, right? Like there were touchscreen Windows tablet computers back in the day, right? But they also had a bunch of buttons on them. They also weren't multi-touch. That was the other big thing with the iPhone, is that it's a multi-touch gesture phone or device, not just I can tap to click. I can actually drag things around. I can do the pinch zooms and different things like that, right? It was originally exclusive to AT&T, which was super awesome because at the time that was the cell provider we had, and I was like, yes. And my parents were like, no, we are not dropping that kind of money, because that was unheard of. You're not going to drop, you buy like a little flip phone or a bar phone or something. The phone I had at the time was one of those old blue Nokia bar phones, right? So like, this was like discovering fire. You know what I mean? Like this was amazing. The first touchscreen phone I mentioned that a second ago really was the first touch-focused, or touch-exclusive, I guess, multi-touch gesture device, not just phone. Competed with BlackBerry, because up to this point we had Blackberries that's where people had their digital lives, right? Like sometimes the BlackBerry might even have a stylus, so it had some touch gestures, right? Hewlett-Packard made a Windows Pocket personal data assistant, PDA, right? And then eventually what happened is BlackBerry got rid of BlackBerry OS and they started running Android on their phones. So it's kind of ironic that like Apple was competing with them, then Android shows up, which we'll discuss here in a minute, and was competing with them, and now they've abandoned their original software altogether for Android. So it's kind of interesting to see how that sort of thing happens. Also, you may recall Microsoft entered the phone game with Windows Phone, and now Windows phones all run Android. So it's just interesting to see that has happened. It's Apple's second mobile device after the Newton in the 90s. If you get a chance, look up the Apple Newton. It's pretty cool. All right, Android. First released on the T-Mobile G1 in September of 2008. That's what that is there on the left. I have T-Mobile now. I wish I would have had it back then, because, man, every time that I saw the commercial, it had Eric Clapton in it, was one of them. The other one had Cat Stevens, or Yusuf Islam, as he is known now. And it was just, I just remember thinking, like, there it is. That's the phone, right? Like, yeah, it's got the touch screen, all this different stuff, but it's got a slide-out keyboard. Oh man, that's really neat. Like, it's the best of all the worlds, right? Written in Java, but inspired heavily by iOS. We're going to watch a video clip here in a minute that talks a little bit more about this, but the Google folks actually were allowed to, they basically went to Steve Jobs and said, hey man, like, you're our hero. Can we see what you guys are working on? And they were like, he was like, yeah, for sure. Check out this thing. And he showed them the iPhone. And they were like, oh, that's amazing. That's so cool. Wow. How did you ever think of that? And they really like buttered him up. And then went back to Google and started working on Android. And he later on said that he was prepared to use every single penny of Apple's $9 billion in the bank to go thermonuclear war on Google and destroy them. Obviously, he never did that.
He
said that he would.
Awesome.
It's open source in contrast to iOS, which is really, I think, more than anything else what made him mad, right? It wasn't so much that they stole his product, which they did, in a way, but it's more so that they open sourced it. Because the thing was, like, now he doesn't control this concept at all. Now anybody can take this idea that his company had and run with it, right? So I could see why he would be angry. I think he was angrier than he probably should have been, but I see why he was angry. It's now available on a number of devices, including the Raspberry Pi. Now, that's not entirely accurate. Yes, it's available on the Raspberry Pi, but you need, there's a paid service that basically, like, they've rewritten some of the binaries so that they'll run on a Raspberry Pi, because while Android phones are powered by an ARM processor, the Raspberry Pi architecture, like its ARM processor, is a little bit different than the way that like phone processors work and things like that. It's a little slower for one, but also it processes things in a different way, because it's not intended to be used with Android, right? Android is intended to be on like mobile devices and TVs and things, whereas Raspberry Pi is intended to be like a lightweight desktop operating system or something to that effect, right? All right, now let's watch this video clip real quick. I'm sure I've shown this before. Oh, the irony. Oh, the irony. Okay, so in the video, he says, there's this quote from Picasso that I love that says, good artists borrow and great artists steal. And at Apple, we've always been shameless about stealing good ideas. That was from a documentary in the early 90s called Triumph of the Nerds that aired on PBS. Man, I'm so irritated. I've got to find I'm sure that clip exists elsewhere. I'll track it down. See, will it give me... sometimes it'll give you suggestions. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, so let's move on. Mobile gaming. Words with Friends, Clash of Clans, Candy Crush, Temple Run, Angry Birds, Flappy Bird, right? You're all familiar with mobile games. I chose all of those for a couple of reasons. One, they're all really popular, but two, well, Words with Friends 2 is the popular one now, I guess. They're all popular, but also they kind of run the gamut of the different types of game genres, right? We've got Temple Run, which is an endless runner, which is a subgenre of the platform genre, right? Because there's jumping and obstacle clearance involved. Clash of Clans is like a role-playing game, sort of, and also kind of an RTS in a way, and a couple of other different like role-playing adjacent genres. Candy Crush and Words with Friends, those are puzzle games. Angry Birds, I don't really know what you would consider Angry, because Flappy Bird is an endless runner also. Angry Birds is kind of its own thing. It's sort of a puzzle game, and it's sort of kind of, because it's physics based, right? So you've got to like, you can't just like, it's not like, oh, I'm really good at like shooting people in this particular game, or like I know how to strategize to get like the strongest character in this RPG. It's like, can I understand how far I pull back plus this? So it's, I don't know, it's a sort of a puzzly type game.
I would call it like physics type game.
Yeah, definitely. Because there are games like there's a Crayon Physics. There's also like World of Goo is a similar game that has like, I mean, it's not similar, but it's got like a physics like bent to it, right? And that kind of stuff. You know what's a good game? This is totally unrelated, but a really good game is the Scribblenauts games.
Yeah.
Right?
I've never played this.
So you definitely should just play one level in one game, because the AI in those games is super advanced, and so you open up your notebook and you type out what you want to draw, and the game will generate whatever you tell it to. And it's really funny because not only can it get super specific with what you want, it also knows how to make the objects correctly interact with one another based on what the objects are. So to give you two examples, I asked once for a giant green horned flying pig. Okay, that's what I typed in. And it literally gave me a giant green horned pig with wings. And I sent him in to like fight an enemy, and they killed him. Okay, here's where it gets really cool. When I hovered over him after he died, it had changed his graphic and his name, so he was now a giant green horned flying ham. It turned him into a giant green ham with wings and horns sticking out of it.
That's awesome.
There was another time when I was fighting a vampire, and I was like, I wonder what happens if can I summon a priest? Like, will he like kill the vampire? And yes, he did. He like ran over and like killed him in like one hit. Then I was like, okay, so I can summon a priest. I wonder what else I can summon. So I was like, can I summon the devil? Yep. He popped up on screen. I was like, can I summon God? Yep, I sure can. Do you know what happens when you do that? God opens a portal and sucks the devil in. He's like, he waves his hand in this portal, and the devil's like trying to run away from it, like sucks him in. And I was like, who thinks of those things? Like, it's brilliant that all those features are in there. Anyway, so mobile gaming. It's cheaper to produce because there's no licensing fees or physical media. Now, I say there's no licensing fees. There's not licensing fees in the way there is with like a console. You still have to pay Google and Apple to like become a developer to get into the App Store, right? And there might be other fees associated with being a developer, but it's basically free, right? You know what I mean? Like comparatively speaking, because like development fees, especially if you want physical copies on like an Xbox or something, is like, you can't afford it. Like, it's like you have to be a studio to afford those kind of things, right? Because physical media is expensive to produce and things like that. And even like digital-only developer fees sometimes are pretty expensive, depending on which platform you want to develop for. Nintendo, I believe, at least at one one point recently, this is the case, it may not still be, but had actually the highest licensing fees. I mean, it costs you an arm and a leg to develop for Nintendo. So that's why most people don't. It's easier to distribute, obviously. There's no shelf space, as Gabe Newell from Valve famously said, there is no shelf space, right, on Steam, right? There is just whatever you want. Like, we have all the space in the world you could ever want. Unfortunately, it can nickel and dime players a little bit through microtransactions, right? If you've ever played what I refer to as like tap to win games, not games like Clash of Clans, which is kind of a tap to win game, but games like Family Guy: The Quest for Stuff or The Simpsons Tapped Out, things like that, where like there'll be these limited items that you can only get for like a day, and they're super expensive, and the only way to really get them is spend real world money, and you have to constantly come back to the game and tap on things to collect your money, because things take a while. Like, it's like, oh, this person's gonna like do a jig for 8 hours, you gotta come back in 8 hours, but they collect your coin, they can really nickel and dime you. I've spent money in a mobile game one time. I spent $5, and I felt dirty. I was like, I to this day regret that choice because I don't play that game anymore. It's just $5 that I just wasted on stupid digital goods that don't even exist, right? It's just like, what was I doing? They can also be of low quality. There's a game called, I'll look it up here in a minute. It's like Attack of the Silver Panther or something. Basically, you play as or Attack of the Silver Tiger or something. You play as this like silver tiger in Japan or Thailand or something, and you're a tiger. I mean, that's the whole game. It's like you have to like kill gazelles at one point. But it sounds cool. It's a cool idea, but the controls are really bad and the graphics are terrible. And it got a re-release on the PS3, which is actually how I found out about it. And I was just like, who would make this game? It's really bad if you get a chance to look it up. And that's not the only one. There's a multitude of just, Flappy Bird, if you think about it, is kind of a low quality, right? Kind of a low quality mobile game. It can also contain malicious code, right? So you might be like, oh, this is a Words with Friends clone. It's actually a Steal Your Data clone, right? Whenever you actually run it. Okay, let's watch this video from the gaming historian, and then we'll move on to the next phase of our discussion. This is his trip to the National Video Game Museum in Texas. It's a goal of mine to someday visit this museum. This is everything that my life is about. This is kind of the headquarters for it. So let's kick back and kind of enjoy this, and then we'll move on to talking about the actual development process for video games.
Miles north of Dallas, Texas, lies the city of Frisco, home of the newly opened National Video Game Museum at the Frisco Discovery Center. Founded by friends John Hardy, Sean Kelly, and Joe Santulli, the museum houses 10,000 square feet of exhibits, rare items, displays, and even a full-blown arcade. As you walk in, you are greeted by a giant, playable Pong machine, and along the way, there are plenty of games to try for yourself. The museum is set up into 17 different stages, each one highlighting an important element of video games. Some stages even feature set pieces. One of the more intriguing ones is in the video game Crash of 1983 area.
This little store display, so they kind of like recreated what an independent game store would have looked like as the video game market was crashing. It's kind of like a somber moment, I guess, when you look at it. It's sad.
Of course, there's also a more lighthearted one, such as an average boy's room in the 1980s, complete with a small CRT television, duck hunt, and a fake Playboy under the bed. After touring the museum, I met up with Joe Santulli, one of the founders, and asked him how this all came to be.
I was a pack rat when I was a kid. It's always really important for me to start that way because people are like, how did you let this happen to yourself? I was a pack rat when I was a kid. I was collecting baseball cards, comic books, coins, stamps, board games, right? But once video games came out on cartridges, like the 2600, all of a sudden I had something to collect that was fun. so it wasn't comic books and baseball cards that you put in albums and you leave them aside. This was something I could interact with every day, and now I was building my own library. I started in 1991 an organization called Digital Press, and Digital Press was formed to find other people like me and my friend Kevin and build lists, because there was no internet in 1991, not for us, and we wanted to know what didn't we have, as we're collecting. So Digital Press reached out to a lot of like-minded people, and we started to have this audience of collectors, and then we started to do books about collecting, and then we started to build these complete lists with rarity guides and such. So that phenomenon sort of brought my partners John Hardy and Sean Kelly into the fold. Those guys were subscribers of mine, and we would write to each other, and we kind of became this little network of people. And we decided in 1999 to try doing this show called Classic Gaming Expo in Las Vegas, where we would bring our collections for the first time and make a little museum on card tables and little standees, right? It actually turned out to be a really cool thing. People were like, well, this is great. It's only once a year, but it would be nice if we could see this more often. So we did that show for a bunch of years. Then we were doing industry events. E3 had invited us to do 2003 as an homage to the 10-year anniversary of E3. So we brought our vintage collection. Now we're a traveling museum. All of a sudden we're doing PAX and Game Developer Conference and Kamikaze and anybody else that wanted to have an exhibit of a collection.
While developing and growing the traveling museum, Santulli worked full-time in the pharmaceutical industry. The pay was good, but it was boring. He wanted to turn his passion of video games into a career. So he decided to quit his full-time job and open a video game store in Clifton, New Jersey.
I'll never forget those people when I told them what I was doing. They're like, what? You're going to start your own video game store? It sounds like a crazy thing for a 40-year-old to do after all this time, but I didn't really care, and I opened that store, Digital Press. I called it Digital Press because I figured, well, there's a little bit of name recognition here. Some people might know what it is, but it's just sort of a continuation of a product.
Since opening in 2005, Digital Press has become one of the most well-known stores in the gaming community, holding monthly meetups known as NAVA, where collectors can hang out, play games, and trade collection pieces.
I always tell the employees their orientation is you have to think of this place as it's the Disneyland of game stores. Like, we want it to always be really clean. You want your customers to all walk out happy.
Yeah.
And I think we do a pretty good job with that.
With Santulli concentrating full-time on video games and collecting, the museum continued to tour conventions and trade shows throughout the country. But soon, the three friends concluded they needed a permanent home for their traveling exhibit.
We did a Kickstarter in 2011 where the goal was get our stuff into every possible industry event that we could find and pitch the idea of having a place permanent. We were considering anywhere for a while.
Okay.
I mean, because we had traveled so much, we had collections all over the country, and we could have gone really literally anywhere that had a good space for us. Lo and behold, we're at a show that we never would have gone to if it wasn't for a Kickstarter called DICE. It's also in Las Vegas. It's an executive level industry event. And we were set up in a very little room, much like this one, with our typical arcade games, a couple of important pieces for a museum, and we have this signature 80s living room, which we would do at industry events everywhere. So that 80s living room was the place where we met Randy Pitchford because IGN was bringing people in there to do interviews. This was just a cool backdrop for them. Randy, after his interview, is looking around. He's like, what is this? You guys building a museum? Like, I want to build a museum. I have a little museum in my office. I'm moving to Frisco. I think maybe I have the right spot for you. And that kind of got the ball rolling here in Frisco. So we ended up partnering with him, partnering with the city. This place is great. It's centrally located. We're in a nice facility. The community digs what we're doing.
Meeting the mayor of Frisco only confirmed that they had found the perfect home.
Yeah, Mayor Masso, he kind of astounded me. You expect the mayor to come in. It's like, here we go. I got to take the guy through the thing, and he's just going to say, oh, this is a great job. Instead, the guy gravitates towards this row of computers that we have, and he's asking these questions like, oh, tell me you guys have, an Acorn computer system, because that's what I was running when I was in college, and we'd run, versions of Colossal K's. I'm like, Really? This is the mayor of this city? Awesome, right?
Yeah.
Perfect guy, perfect fit for us. It's our collections. It's the three of us and our collections. There's a few donated pieces, but when I say that, it's not, now that we're open, we'll see donations come in. But we had accepted to some degree some donations over the years as a traveling museum. And if you look around, you'll see a lot of dev stuff, right? And prototype cartridges. So things that you wouldn't have gotten through retail channels. A lot of that stuff was donated over the years because running Classic Gaming Expo and doing all those industry events, we're in constant contact and hunting down these game developers over the years and telling them, look, this stuff is important whether you think it is or not. I think we have a place for it. There's a place in history for all of that development stuff, which I think you can see here. You know, if you go over to that third-party section, you can see David Crane's Game Boy system development system that he used to design Rescue of Princess Blobette. That's exactly what happened with all of that equipment that's sitting there. So what we ended up doing with 10,000 square feet is presenting you with 17 stories, 17 things that we want you to study, have fun with, interact with, and learn something about, so that when you leave, you can almost say, here are the 17 things I learned today about how sound is important, why online gaming is important, how game developers have given me the option to create games within their games. You know, what does it take to get involved in the gaming business by looking at Randy Pitchford's office, you know, as it looked in Plano.
While the museum is new and finally open to the public, Joe admits that this is only the beginning of their vision. Eventually, they would love to add an archive center, theater room, and a game library, where people could come in and play over 12,000 game titles from every system imaginable.
That's the 1.0 version that you see here. We still have all of those things waiting for a 2.0. So if things go well here, we do plan on expanding even further and being able to someday have that library and archival facility. So what really we wanted is a dedicated 100%, it's video gaming, it's computer gaming, it's handhelds, it's arcade cabinets, we wanted to make sure that all of that, every piece of that culture was all contained within one building. And I think we've done that. And I know that we're the first place that's dedicated to simply video games.
Right.
Pretty incredible. It's obviously put a lot of time and money into this place. This isn't like some little traveling exhibit you see at those conventions. This is like an actual museum. They thought out the different stages, the walking layout. I mean, it's an actual legit museum. It's really good. Really takes you through the evolution of video games.
Funding for Gaming Historian is
Okay, so pretty cool. Couple of quick things. First of all, I think the idea of the little living room is really, really cool. I would like to see a place where you can go and rent a fake living room for a period of time and like play some retro games and stuff like that. I think it's really neat. There's also, you may have noticed the balance board, joy board thing that was, it's actually, I think it's right here. I think it's actually what that is. But he just released a video a couple of days ago on it. And I actually haven't watched this video since 2 semesters ago, so I didn't remember that was in there. But yeah, pretty neat, right? Pretty cool. Makes me really happy to see that somebody is trying to preserve them in video games in the same way that other artifacts are preserved, right? Okay, so let me hop over and load up our next PowerPoint. It shouldn't take very long. There's not that many slides. How many were in the last? Oh yeah, this won't take long at all. Okay. Video game design and development, the department's roles and processes. Or process, sorry, not processes, process. I made this PowerPoint, you'd think I know what it says. All right, back in the day, game designers were often single individuals who were responsible for all aspects of gameplay. Pretty interesting to think about that. They talked about that in the documentary that we watched, and I've mentioned it before, but it's just interesting to think that they would literally just like bring you a manual that explained how to program for like the Atari 2600. They would say, okay, we'll see you in a month. And they'd show back up and say, what do you got? Like, well, I made a game where a little square moves across the screen. It's like, congratulations, good job. Like, what do you do in the game? Well, you move from here and you pick up this other square. Cool. You got to add sound. You got to figure out how to draw and render the graphics, right? All that kind of stuff. Atari originally refused to credit developers. Several of those individuals left to form Activision, which was the first third-party developer. And as with the early computer industry and film and television 7 decades earlier, there were no colleges or universities with a game design curriculum. So, while there were many with a computer science background, there were also musicians, graphic artists, writers, and more. Steve Jobs talks about that in that Triumph of the Nerds documentary. He talks about that, like when the Macintosh was being developed. He said, in the early days of the computer industry, he said there were no computer. Really, there weren't really computer science curriculums. Like, they existed, and you could go to college and kind of learn about computers a little, but you were usually like an electrical engineer or a mathematician or something. Like, there were things that were computer adjacent, and there was some computing. It's not, I don't want to act like, I mean, as you remember from last semester, it's not as though like there weren't computers. It's just they weren't as hardly widespread. I mean, the university was probably your first exposure to a computer, right? In a lot of cases. So there were people with all these different varied backgrounds. I use the film and television industry because, does anyone know what the first university in America was to offer a curriculum in film? UCLA. UCLA was the first place to do that, and it was kind of unheard of at the time. I mean, literally unheard of, but it was like unheard of in the sense of like, no, you don't go to school for this. No. Just like with animation, right? Like, no, you don't go to school for this. No, you just go do it, right? Like, do you have a vision to be like are you a good writer? Do you want to make movies and you're right? We'll just move out to California and become a movie maker, become a filmmaker, get involved in the industry, right? Same with animation. Like, Walt Disney was a commercial artist that did illustrations for businesses and things, and then got a little bit of money to make some short animated films and things like that. He didn't go to school to become an animator, right? It's the same sort of way in the early days here. But as time went on, more and more developers began demanding credit, saying, hey, how come the 5 people that wrote that popular song are all credited in the album's liner notes, but you can go through it and you can play a whole game of Atari's and go through the entire manual and box and every other material that comes with it, and my name is nowhere to be found, despite the fact that I'm the only, I literally worked by myself to make this game, and all 5 of those people that wrote that song got credited, right? The directors get credited in movies, and the actors and everybody else. Why don't we get credit, right? So it's kind of serendipitous, because at the same time that they're starting to demand more credit, systems are starting to become more sophisticated, and games are starting to become longer, more complicated, so it becomes obvious that the solo approach doesn't really work. You can't really say, hey, individual person, go make World of Warcraft. That's not something, I mean, this is way before the World of Warcraft, but like, you couldn't do that. You couldn't send one person into a room. I mean, there are certainly people like Phil Fish that made, I think that was his name, that made Fez, or like Notch that made the original incarnation of Minecraft, right? One person can certainly make a really impressive stuff on their own, but those sorts of things are few and far between, and typically it takes years, if not decades, for you to make your game, whereas a studio can make a game in a year or two, right? So as a result of this, game development began to take on a more team-based approach with various specialized departments. Speaking of those departments, now there's no standard, there's no like manual that says when you start a game studio, here are the departments you have and here's how they're organized. But it's kind of a rule of thumb. You're typically going to have the following ones here. Now, the very last one I want to mention first, the administrative one. Most game studios are what we call vertical, which is to say that like the administrators, so like the CEO of that studio, or like the director of the game, or whatever, the producer of the game, they're above you in the hierarchy, right? So like they're your boss. They're above everybody. And then each department has a boss, right? Like the art department will have a boss, thing like that. Valve is considered horizontal, which, although there are people like Gabe and other individuals that are the bosses, the up above, it's not they're not broken up into these teams really. Like people that work on like the art might also be programmers. They might also do sound and voice acting. There's a lot of fluid movement between the departments, but also no one is seen as over anyone else. It's just like, no, we're just one big team. Kind of like what they talked about with Bungie last week, right? With the idea of when they were making Halo, is like, no, we have this big open space that anyone can walk around in and kick around ideas, right? So here are our departments real quick. We have story, which is your story and lore writers, quest designers, that sort of thing. Your art department, they're going to do concept art, they're going to do sprites and backgrounds, they're going to make textures perhaps. Your modelers, they might be part of the art department, they may not be. Some different people do it differently, right? Like some people are like, no, these are the graphic artists that are going to draw out the concept art, and this other department, they're the modelers that are going to create the 3D models for the game. Because really, when you think about it, there are two separate skills. I mean, like not just because you're good at drawing doesn't mean you can make 3D models and vice versa. I can't do either, right? I mean, I can do stuff in Photoshop, but like if you require me to draw something with my own hand or create a 3D model, it's just like I've taken 3D animation, but I'm not terribly good at it. Like I know it well enough I could teach it. Like I know the concepts of 3D animation, but I don't have the artistic ability to make it look good. So if you were like, show me how to make a pencil in like Blender or something, I can make you a cruddy looking 3D pencil, but I can't animate it, make it look good, and do different stuff, right? Okay, so anyway, programming, your coders, music and sound, voice acting. Now, obviously, not all games or studios will need or have one, right? And sometimes they're part of the music and sound department, but generally speaking, they're separate. And anybody want to guess why they're typically separate from music and sound? Think of who you have to work with voice acting. Celebrities, yes, but also people potentially that are external to your organization, right? So like it's not just me and my buddies that are sitting down to make some music and sound effects. Now I've got to like, and also as someone who has both done voice acting and worked with like, I've done voice acting and also been the director of people doing voice acting. It's kind of it's not fun. Like voice acting is like, it's a long, dry, very frustrating process. And so it's like, typically people who are like, no, I'm a musician, they don't want to be dealing with people that are like, okay, record this word over and over and over and over until we get a version that sounds like what we want and that kind of stuff, right? Quality assurances, your game testers, things like that. And then finally your marketing department. Now, I already mentioned administration, but your marketing folks. So here's the life cycle of a game. Now again, there is no standard. Not every game uses these steps. This will differ depending on your budget, the size of your studio, the type of game that it is, right? Like a game that has multiplayer is more apt to have a beta than a game that doesn't, right? Like a single player game almost never has a beta because there's really, I mean, your game testers typically have like taken care of the beta testing, right? But we have pre-alpha. Okay, this is like, it's an idea at this point. We choose our genre. We talk about characters, plot lines, and themes. I don't have it on here, but you might decide on an engine if you're going to use one. Your developers might start talking about that. Then once we kind of have an idea, rough idea of what we're doing, we go into the alpha stage where we choose our characters. The art department begins to create concept art. The writers begin to expand the character descriptions and develop plot outlines. The programmers begin constructing game logic. So if we know that it's like a 2D platformer, and we're going to use Unity, they might go into Unity and create a bunch of like squares and rectangles to represent players and things, so they can start building here's the player movement script, here's the jump script, here's like all these different things, right? So that when the time comes, they can just slap the art on top of it, as it were. As the concept art is finalized, the modelers at the game is 3D begin creating the 3D models and other 3D objects for the game. As the story and script is finalized, the programmers implement the models or sprites and the script, and the marketing department begins to promote the game. Now, when they're promoting the game in the alpha stage, it's going to be things like, hey, we're releasing a game. Check back later. It's real vague. Because at this point, like, you should look it up if you get a chance. Blizzard tweeted out it was the 30th anniversary of World of Warcraft, or of Blizzard the other day, and it was like the 20th anniversary or 25th of World of Warcraft. And so they tweeted out a screenshot of the alpha build of World of Warcraft, and it literally looked like, it doesn't look anything like the final game at all. Right, so like you're gonna release those like really early screenshots, maybe some test footage, things like that. But even then, maybe not. Just a logo might be all you release. To give you another example, do you remember when Final Fantasy 15 was Final Fantasy 13 Versus Remember when that was the case? And they released a trailer. It's basically what eventually became the intro to Final Fantasy 15. But it changed. I mean, that was back in like 2008 or 9, and the final version looked nothing like it and was released like a decade later, right? So, anyway, we move into closed/open beta. Playtesters play specific parts of the game over and over, looking for bugs and flaws. As I have said many times, being a playtester is not a fun job. It is not, hey, I play video games all day. It's, hey, I get to press the jump button 300 times in a row and see what happens, right? I try to attempt to break the game. I attempt to overflow data and variables and things like that, right? Each play session results in reports that are shared with each department. Changes are made as required. Focus groups are formed. They play the games, or sometimes are shown demonstrations. In the case of like Sonic 2, for example, if you've ever read the book Console Wars, in the case of Sonic 2, early on, the focus groups didn't play any of the games. They just watched footage of someone else playing it and that kind of stuff. And then feedback is collected and changes are made as required. And the marketing department increases their efforts. So now they're going to start saying, hey, join the open beta, or hey, don't forget it's coming out March 4th, or whatever it is, right? Then lastly, the release candidate / client, or RC, when the team feels the game is ready, or in some cases, if a predetermined date arrives. Sometimes we'll say this is the release date, and come hell or high water, that game's get released on that day, right? One of two things will happen. Either you're going to release a broken game, which happens a lot, or you're going to have a ton of crunch right at the end, which also happens a lot. Either way, don't choose your release date until the game is done, right? Wait till the game is finished, and then say, hey, here in 2 weeks or a month or a year it's coming out, or whatever, right? The game is released to the public at that time. The marketing department promotes the game, and then as needed, the developers update and patch the game. Day one patching happens all the time now. They'll do stuff where they'll just release a game, and then be like, all right, you can't play it for 2 hours because we got a 18 gig patch that has to download to fix all the things that were broken with the game the first time, right? All right, game genres. Now, there are a ton of sub-genres, right? I'm like under platformer, endless runner, I mentioned that a second ago. I mentioned MOBA and MMORPG at the bottom, which technically fall into role-playing, but they're also kind of their own thing. They're simultaneously sub-genres and also their own genre, right? So we have platformer, puzzle, classic / card / board games, so things like, chess or whatever. Shooters, sports, driving / racing, hunting / simulation. So hunting and simulation would encompass everything from like Cabela's Dangerous Hunts or something, all the way to like SimCity, right? Like anytime that you're simulating a potential real world experience, right? There's a little bit of gray area between like what is a simulation and what is a God game, right? I tend to typically think that God games and simulations are pretty much the same thing. The only difference is like to what degree do you have power, right? In a hunting game, you don't have God status. In SimCity, you do. But really at the core of it, you're simulating either a hunt, which you could do in real life, or the management of a city, which you could also do in real life as the mayor or something. So then we have adventure / role playing, so everything from like The Legend of Zelda all the way to like the Final Fantasy games, right? We have fighting games, we have strategy games, so real-time turn-based strategy, any of those. Then we have MOBAs, multiplayer online battle arenas, so games like League of Legends, which are, or games like Dota 2, which are technically role-playing games, right? But they're also kind of fighting games because there's like PvP combat, and they're sort of their own thing. And they have things in common, like tower defense type stuff, right? Or like base defense. And then MMORPGs, which are identical to single-player RPGs, except they are massively multiplayer online games that have a ton of people playing at once that can interact and communicate as though they were in a real culture, okay? Keep that last sentence I just said about as though they were in a real culture or a real place. Keep that in mind for the next slide. The dreaded assignment. Okay, so now this is part of your final, so you have until finals week to get this done, okay? So you have about 9 weeks, give or take. Not quite, but about 9 weeks. For part of your final, I would like you to write a paper that adheres to the following. APA format. If you're not familiar with APA format, I highly suggest checking out Purdue's online writing lab. If you just Google Purdue OWL, O-W-L, it will give you everything you could ever possibly want to know about how to write an APA format. And trust me, it's not that hard. Now, there are some like really specific things in APA, but we're not going to get into it. Like, basically, as long as you correctly cite your sources and you have a title page and an abstract and reference, like the basic bare bones of an APA paper, that's all I care about. You can also check out Pan's Learning Lab. She and her associates and cronies would love nothing more than to help you learn how to write in APA format. So feel free to tap her if necessary. 3 to 6 pages, not including your title page, abstract, or references / appendices, okay? Appendices. So there should be 3 to 6 pages of content. Now when you double space 3 to 6 pages, 3 pages is not that much information, right? And based on the topics that I'm about to read from this list here, you should have absolutely no problem whatsoever, especially if it's well researched, which as you'll see is the third bullet point there, researched and written at or near college level. Now, Kyle, Dawn, Alex, I have no doubt in your ability to write a paper at the college level. Xander, Ari, and Matthew, I've not seen any papers that you have written, and also you are seniors or juniors in high school, so I don't expect you to be able to write a college level paper. I do expect you to research it to the best of your ability, get help if necessary, and write it to the best of your ability, get help if necessary. Now, what I would really like is start working on this now, and here in 2 or 3 weeks, bring me a draft and say, is this kind of what you're looking for? Does this seem like, do I sound like I know what I'm talking about? Is this in the format you want? And I can give you some feedback. I don't want to require that you turn in a draft, but I might going forward. Okay. So here's one of the following topics: a detailed description of one or more console / gaming generations, the causes, short-term effects, and long-term effects of the video game crash of 1983. Console manufacturers who are not Nintendo, Microsoft, or Sony. This may be a good time to talk about Sega, SNK, or Neo Geo SNK. I can't remember what the company is. Bandai made a console with Apple called the Pippin. You might talk about that. You might talk about the Mattel Hyperscan that I mentioned a moment ago, the Mattel Intellivision, the ColecoVision, right? There's all kinds of consoles you could talk about. Nintendo's content policies of the 80s and early to mid-90s, women and or minorities in game development, diversity in game design, the Wii's virtual console and the rise of retro gaming, digital downloads and the possible end of physical media, copyright, balance, I say versus, but like balanced against archiving and preservation, right? So like, are we violating, like, is it a violation of someone's copyright that we're like making backups of a game so that it doesn't disappear forever? The ethics, speaking of which, the ethics of emulation and or backup copies, the history and or ethics of the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and lastly, I told you to keep that in mind about World of Warcraft and stuff, live streaming and or digital cultures / communities, okay? There is a boatload of research on every single one of those topics, right? So that's why I said there should be no issue with you writing at least 3 pages, okay? Don't stress, because I'm not going to be a jerk about it. Like, I'm not going to be like, oh, well, you like don't have a comment here, 0. Like, I'm wanting to see, can you go out based on a prompt, which is one of these things, and write a paper. I would like for you to send me an email by next Friday, by class next week, telling me which one of these you want to do. I'd prefer if there are no duplicates, but if 2 people are super passionate about like the same, they can do the same topic. I don't care. In fact, actually, if that's the case, if 2 people are really passionate about the same thing, like nobody wants to back down, I'll just have you work as a team. Have you work as a 2-person team or something like that.
Or we can do it kind of like the console wars, where we take notes in between of what they're doing and make our papers better.
You could also do that. Very seriously, I mean, that's also possible. So if that comes up, we'll talk about how we want to handle it. But yeah, there's a number of really cool ways I think we could probably handle that, okay? All right. One more thing, and then we will move on to our discussion that I mentioned. Okay, so we are going to watch this quick video here. Kyle has already seen it. I don't believe I played it in any other classes. If I played it in C#, no, you wouldn't have had C#. Okay, so I don't think anybody has seen this. You may have seen it in 120 last semester, but I'm pretty sure you didn't. But this is how to use a game called, okay, I'm going to pronounce it phonetically. I know this is not correct. The name of the software is Irish for music box. Okay, it is phonetically Bosca Seoil, Ceoil, Seoil. He doesn't know how to pronounce. He's Swedish and he doesn't know how to pronounce it either. But I told you I never read the comments. on YouTube. I did read the ones on this because I was like, surely somebody knows like the proper pronunciation here. And I scrolled down, and there was like 4 people that were like, "Yeah, I'm Irish." And they gave like in parentheses like it's actually like Boska Keol or something like that. But and if you're interested, look in the description. But this software is on all 4 of those computers in the back. But if you'd like, I can get it on your your computers as well. Okay. All right. So let's check this video out, and then we will have our discussion that I said we would have, and then we'll go on break, come back, and start working on our game design document, which is all the important info about, you know, the levels in our game and that sort of thing. All right, let's hop over here and check this out.
So if you want to make music for your game, there's a billion different ways to go about it. And there's so many different programs to help you with it. Today we'll be looking at one that is super quick and easy to use. It's called Buzzcut something. It's a great tool. I've used it for a lot of game jams. So let's go ahead and get started. So to get started, go to buzzcacl.net. I will have a link in the description to those of you who don't want to spell that. Here you can choose between the online version or downloading to your computer. I find the online version works pretty well, but I always like having it on my system. Let's hit download, choose a platform, and it's going to start downloading. On Windows, it will download as a zip file, so simply unzip that and you should get a folder with an exe that we can go ahead and open up. So here's what it looks like. Some people get a bit confused about the interface, but let's just start from the beginning. Let's begin by hitting New Song. We then choose the BPM, which is our tempo. I'm going to set this down to 80. We can also select how many notes we want to make up a pattern. What we're looking at here is one pattern. And inside of a pattern, we can place notes. So here's the amount of notes that will make up our pattern, and the small number is how many notes we want to make up a bar. So if we change this to say 8, you can see that we now have 2 bars of 8 notes each. Most songs are written in 4/4, which means that we will have 4 notes, each with the length of 1/4 a bar. So we'll just leave that at 4/16. And now we can start placing notes by simply clicking and dragging. You can start and pause playback by hitting the space key, and you can remove notes by right-clicking. If you want to control the length of your note, we use the scroll wheel. Some people can find it really daunting to have all of these different options. Well, the music that we normally listen to is set in a certain scale. We can think of a scale as a selection of some of these notes that go well together. And we can define a scale by going to the bottom right corner and first selecting a key. This is going to be the base note for our scale. Then we can choose what scale. Most of the music that we listen to are either set in major or minor. Major often giving a happy feel and minor more of a sad feel. But there are lots of others to choose from, like blues and all of the pentatonic scales, along with some more exotic ones. We'll just set ours to major. And you can see now that it's really narrowed down the possibilities that we have in terms of notes. And so now we should be able to just go nuts placing notes along the scale and have it sound okay. So let's make a short song. I'm going to use my scroll wheel to make a bigger note. I'm then going to create a C chord, that's C, E, G. I'm then going to make a D minor chord, that's D, F, and then A. Let's follow that up with a G, that's G, B, and D. The last chord here is pretty stretched out from the rest of them, and in general it tends to sound better if chords are close to each other. We can actually just take the G here and raise it to the octave above, so we simply go and select the G up here. Now the notes are much closer and we can have a listen. So the sound that we're currently using is really bad. Let's go into Instrument, and here we can change the sound of our instrument. This is a tiny bit weird because the first tab here allows you to choose an instrument, and then the second one allows you to choose a sound. However, for the instrument MIDI, which is not actually an instrument but a technique for triggering audio, well then in here we have different categories as well. So just remember that you can always go into MIDI to get more options. I just want to hit the plus sign here in order to cycle through. I think this sound is pretty good. However, it's a bit too clear on the high notes. To get rid of those, we can use this low pass filter. If I play and start adjusting this, you can hear that we can cut off a bunch of frequencies for this sound. And we can do this for any instrument. So when you've chosen a sound that you're happy with, let's go ahead and add another instrument. To do that, we hit Add New Instrument. For this one, I want a bass. So let's go and change the instrument to a bass. And I just want to use the analog bass. Notice how you can also fine-tune the volume of each instrument over here. However, I don't want to write my bass line on top of our chords. So let's go into Arrangement And here we can see how we can combine different patterns in order to make up our song. We have our first pattern here, which is our chord progression. We can then hit add new, select the new pattern, click on the new pattern to select it, and you can see our color changes. We can also see that at the bottom left here, this pattern is using the analog bass, but we could easily have the second pattern use the electric piano as well. So we can always swap between those down here. You'll notice that if you place a note and hit play, it's not playing. The reason why is that we also need to insert our pattern into the arrangement. So let's start by only playing the chords. Let's then play both the chords and the bass. To copy the chords, we can simply drag on them, and then we can go from there. But again, if we hit play, it's just gonna loop the first chord. That's because down here, you can see what part of the song we currently want to play. We can click on a particular bar, or we can click and drag to play a longer part of the song. So in our case, let's just click on the second bar here, so we can hear what our chord will sound like with our bass. So our bass is currently playing a really high note. This is not really what we're going for. Well, you can navigate through tone height by going to the right and pressing up or down. Or you could use WS or even the up and down arrow keys. I always just have my hands placed on the keyboard ready to press W and S. Let's now remove this note and let's try placing one down here. That sounds a lot better. Also, remember to change the scale for this instrument as well. So we'll set that to major. So let's write our bass. So here's what mine sounds like. Let's add a melody on top. Let's go instrument, add a new instrument. This could definitely be a chip tune, and let's just start with the square wave. Now let's go back into our arrangement. Let's add a new pattern. It's automatically selected the square wave, so that's good. Let's make another duplicate of our chord and of our bass. And let's now add this new pattern on top. Let's also make sure to preview that region and change the scale to major. Also, when listening through the song before, I noticed our chords were a bit bright. Let's select the pattern and let's maybe shift these an octave down. We could go and write all of the chords again, or we could use the plus and minus here at the bottom. So our first chord starts at the C. Let's then hit the minus key until we get to the lower C. And let's now have a listen again. That's so much better. Alright, so let's construct a melody. We could definitely add some more texture to this. So I've gone ahead and added an extra layer to this melody. I definitely like this, however the melody is currently taking over the whole piece. So let's go into the instrument, let's try and play around with the sound. So I really like the dual square for this one. Finally, let's add some drums. Let's hit add new instrument. Let's choose drum kit. I think we'll just go with the simple drum kit. Let's then go under the arrangement. Let's add a new pattern. Let's also drag this in. Notice that we don't have any scale controls here. That's because the different notes map to different drums. So we have 3 different bass drums, 2 snares, 2 hi-hats, and a crash. Let's start by adding in some bass drum. Let's also throw in a snare. And the hi-hat here can be pretty dominating, but I definitely want to have some in there. I'll even throw in a crash on the 4. Finally, we probably want to add some variation to our song. Because we're simply reusing the same patterns, this will quickly become very repetitive. But the program actually makes variation really easy to do. Let's add a variation to a melody. To do that, instead of simply clicking and dragging, we'll use the middle mouse button and then drag. Now it's created a duplicate of that pattern, and we can go in and edit specific notes. Let's also bring over all of our other tracks, set the playback to this particular bar, and just change around a few things. Even though almost all of our elements are the same, having just the melody vary will really help keep things interesting. So now let's listen to our entire arrangement. Awesome! From here on out, it's just about adding more patterns, creating more variation, and combining different patterns in order to create new interesting results. Also, whenever you're doing a song that is based on patterns like this, it's a good idea to throw in a break once in a while. Or maybe even a contrast piece where something completely different happens. I also just want to show you that if you go to Advanced, you can actually add swing to your sound. Now this is probably going to sound horrible for our song, but if you're going for that swing jazz feel, try bumping this up. It's not great for this one. Finally, to export your song, go to File, Export, and here we can choose between a WAV file, which is an audio file, or a MIDI file if you want to load it into a MIDI editor. If you want to import this into a game engine, you would probably select the first one. It's then going to play through your entire song while it's exporting. And at the end, we can choose where to save it. Let's hit save, and we now have a song clip that you can share with your friends or throw into a game. That's pretty much everything for Bus Castile. I just want to leave you with one very, very, very important note, and that is to always remember to save your CL file and do this a lot of time while making it. So this is the project file that you can then later load up. Make sure to do this because for some stupid reason this program will close if you click on something wrong, it will create a new song and sometimes might even crash. And it's not going to prompt you or anything, it just does so. I've lost so much work because I forgot to save. So please do that. That's also the only issue I've had. Other than that, have fun guys. That's pretty much it for this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe.
I really like that video a lot because, okay, so first of all, let me just like calm you down if you're freaking out. I don't expect anyone, unless you want to like duplicate exactly what he's doing to make his exact song, I don't expect anything of that quality, right? I'm talking like do me a bar or two that just, so that I understand that you can manipulate the program as necessary. The idea is, what I would like to see is if somebody is musically inclined, I would like to see them use that program to make music for our game. Right? There's a bunch of free resources we can use, but it'd be really cool if it's like, yeah, we did all that. Like, you know, we did the graphics, we did the programming, we did the sound, right, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, are there any questions, concerns, comments, thoughts, ideas before we have our brief discussion and then go on break? No? Okay, I am going to stop our live stream so that we can have a discussion without fear of anyone outside of this class watching it. Not because we're going to talk about anything inappropriate, but just about, we're going to talk about some kind of sensitive concepts, such as diversity and inclusion in game and also application development. And I just want everyone to feel like they can ask questions and speak freely without fear of being judged. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that stream, and then we will start having